So let's take a quick look at our logic, a review from the last presentation. I have a player manager, and on the player manager I have one state, and I'm doing two things. I'm converting a float to a string. That's where we're taking the global variable of points that we made and translating it to store it in a points string variable, local variable that we made. And then later, after we can do all the conversions, we're taking a GUI label action and we're printing that variable to screen. That gives us an output, in this case, of 10. And the reason it's 10 is because when we went and modified our global variables, we've chosen that points value, and just to get some kind of output, we told the float value to start at 10. We'll change that in just a little bit. But right now we have this value. The result is that we're printing to the top left corner of our screen. Now the next thing that I want to do is I want to take my pickup cube and I want to modify some of the actions, or I want to add some additional actions to this cube so that it not only destroys itself when we pick it up, but it also finds that global points variable and adds to it. So I'm going to go find the pickup cube, and just as a quick reminder, our pickup cube is idling. It's in an idle state, and it has a transition that is a pickup. We have a trigger event that's listening for a collider with the player object. If the player collides with that trigger object, it's going to send an event which is called picked up, which we declared, and we pass that over to this state. The state that says destroy itself simply destroys itself. That's the name of the action. But in addition to that, instead of just destroying itself, what we want to do is we also want to influence the value of the global points. That's the beautiful thing about variables, is that they are in fact variable. They can change over time based on whatever we decide to do with them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go find the math category. And you'll notice that inside the math category, we have a lot of different things that we can do to values. And in this case, we're looking for a float add. And so I'm going to select the destroy self state on the pickup cube, and I'll just double click on float add. What we're going to do is we're going to find the value. We're going to go find a variable, which is a global variable. It's points. And we're going to add a value to it. I'm going to choose 10 as the value to add. I'm not going to do it every frame, and I'm not going to do it per second. I just want it one time. So the result of this cube is that it's going to sit and listen for a trigger event with the player character. When that happens, it's going to transition over to the destroy self. The destroy self is doing two things. It's destroying itself, and then it's finding the value of global points, and it's adding 10 to it. Now, I do want to make sure that I move the math function above the destroy self, because it's very likely that it's going to destroy itself and not have a chance to actually add to the float. If that happens quick enough, it's going to be destroyed, and then it won't run this last command. So if I just flip those two in order, I'm less likely to get a little strange bug that may result in these points not adding. So let's test this. I'm going to hit the play button. I'm going to go find my cube, and while I'm heading towards my cube, I'm paying attention to the top left-hand corner, that value of 10. And once I cross the threshold of that cube, you can see that it bumps up to the value of 20. So now I have this variable effect that's taking effect. It's taking the value of points and updating that. Let me extend this test to be a little bit more clear. I'm going to select the pickup cube, and I'm going to right-click on it and choose to duplicate it. I'll just move that cube over just a little bit. I'll do the same thing with this cube, but this time I'll use the quick key combination of Command D, which duplicates that same cube, and I'll just make a couple of different duplicates, and I'll move those over. I'll hit the play button, and as you would expect, as I run across these cubes, I should see my point value ramp up in the left-hand corner. So that's working exactly the way that I wanted to. So these cubes currently are the good cubes. These are the cubes that are adding to our points. And if we wanted to modify one of these cubes, I'll just duplicate it and I'll move it over. And in fact, I'm going to right-click in my assets folder, and I'm going to create a materials folder. Oops. Let me undo. I didn't want to create a material. Let me delete that. I'm getting ahead of myself. Create folder. I'll call this materials, and inside materials I will right click and choose to create a material. I'll call this bad cube, and of course we'll set this to red. So I have a very clear visual distinction between these cubes and then the bad cube. Now the bad cube, I'll select it, and maybe I'll even call this, instead of pickup cube, I'll call this bad cube. And rather than waiting for idle, and then when it gets a collision or a trigger event with the player character, rather than adding 10 to the value, maybe I'll add -10 to the value. So now the result should be that I can go collect some cubes, and these cubes will increase that value. And then of course when I pick up the red cube, it'll decrease that value. So I'll review that process from the ground up very quickly, from the point where we create a pickup cube and the player manager, and I'll do that as quick as I can just to kind of reinforce that entire workflow. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select all of the pickup cubes. I'm going to command delete, and it looks like I got the player manager in there as well, and everything else should be good. Let me just undo and make sure that I did, in fact, yes, I did get the player manager. I got the pickup cube, I got the bad cube, I got all sorts of stuff here, and I'll just hit delete. And now I'll rebuild this from the ground up. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create the cube that I want to use as my first pickup cube. And so I always like to prototype with these cubes. We can always change this this geometry later. I'm even going to name this the pickup cube, and I'll create a real quick state machine on it. And that first state will be an idle or a listen or a waiting state, whatever you want to call that. It's just kind of sitting and hanging out, and it is waiting for a physics action, specifically a trigger event. We want to, on trigger, when it collides with the player character, we want to send an event. We don't have any events to send, so we got to start building some transition events. I'll call this simply triggered. I'll go back to the state, so that has been triggered. I'm going to right click and add that as a transition from the idle state. I'm going to add another state, which is destroy me. And we'll wire the triggered event over to the destroy me. On the destroy me, we're going to go to game object, destroy self. In addition to that, this is where we want to start to modify our global variable. Now remember, even though we deleted all of these objects, because we created a global variable, that variable was not attached to any specific state machine. So we still have a global variable called points. So we'll take advantage of that, and we'll use that on the destroy me state, and we'll do a little bit of math. So we'll find the math category. We're going to do a float add on the destroy me state. So we're doing two things. We're doing a float add, and we'll add to the global value of points, and we'll add 10. We're not going to do it every frame. We're not going to do it every second. And then this object destroys itself. Now, before we push forward, I would want to test this, and you'll notice that this actually does not work. It does not get picked up. And the reason for that, if you remember, is that we have not set the collider of that cube as a trigger. It's currently still a collider, which means that we collide with it. We can jump on top of it. We can walk around on it. Not exactly what we want. So I'm going to select the pickup cube. I'm going to go to the inspector and make sure is trigger is selected, and I'm going to hit the play button. Now I'm going to do a quick audit of what's going on inside the state machine that we just created, and you'll notice that when we go over the cube, it completely wipes itself out. That's good. It destroys itself, and presumably it's updating the value of points. I want to make a simple player manager, and I'll do that by creating a game object that's an empty game object. I'm not really concerned with its position in space, but I'll call this player manager. Or player manager, there we go. And this player manager is going to have a state machine, and its first job is going to be to I'll just write HUD for the state, because its job is to print to the heads up display. And we did that by choosing a GUI action. We're specifically looking for a GUI label. Now in the GUI label, we know that we want to print for the text field. We don't want to hardwire anything in here. We want to print a variable. So we click on this little toggle button here, and that gives us the ability to set our variable. Now this text type, this text requires a string. I can see there in the required parameter for that field, it requires a string. So we're going to need to go over to the variables tab and create a new variable, and I'll call this points string. I could call this player points string to be a little bit more specific. Oops, and I inadvertently hit return, which created that player string as a float, which is not what I want, so I'm going to convert that very quickly to a string. I'll select that, and I can see that I have the string value here. Now, I'm not so worried about what the string value is, because I'm going to feed in the value of global points into that string here in just a moment. And so if I look under the convert category, I want to convert a float to a string. So I'll double click. I want to make sure that that happens above the GUI label. The float variable that I want to use is points. The string value that I want to store it in is the string value I just created. I'm not worried about a format, but it is important that I do this every frame, because that value could be changing depending on how many cubes that I pick up. So I'll test this really quickly. I'll hit the play button, and although my in the top left hand corner I don't see anything, so that means I missed something. So I'll jump back into my state. I have convert float to string. That all looks good. I forgot to choose the variable for my text, so I'll choose player points string, and now when I hit the play button, anchor it in the top left hand corner, I have the value of whatever my default value of points are. Now if I run over my cube, with any luck I should bump that value up to 20, and in fact it does work just the way that I intended it to. So I'll make a real quick decision about where I want this to print at. So I'll find the GUI label, and from the left I'll do 0.05. That seemed like a comfortable solution. And from the top I'll do 0.05 as well. And then just to kind of ramp this up, I'll take the pickup cube and I'll Command D to duplicate, and I'll just run several of these cubes out into space. And I'll just make sure that they're all destroying themselves and working the way that I intended them to work. And if I see that points value on screen bumping up as I run into each one of them, that's a good sign. Everything's working just the way I planned. So the next thing I'll do is I'll experiment just with one bad cube. I'll Command D to duplicate. I'll very quickly just throw a material on it just to indicate it's doing something else. With that cube selected, I'll go into the destroy me state, which is where the magic happens with adding to the float. And rather than adding a positive, I'll add a negative value. Now, of course, we could do a couple of different things here. We could actually get rid of this float add, and I could go into the math function and I could do a float. I'm looking for float subtract. I have float absolute, float add multiple, clamp, divide, and interpolate, multiply, operator. There's subtract if I want to use it. So I can double click and do a float subtract, and the value that I would find is the global variable of points, and I'll subtract positive 10 from it. I won't do it every frame and I won't do it per second, but that should give me the result that I need. So I'll hit the play button. But again, that was unnecessary using the subtract action. I could have just left it adding to a negative value. So that works just the way that I want it to. I have some good stuff I can collect. I have some bad stuff I want to avoid. And I can start to use that and introduce that into my environment. And in the future presentation, what I'll do is we'll build a scenario where on our player manager, not only are we printing out the value of, in this case, points, which will convert to health here in just a short bit, but when our health hits a certain point, if it hits 0 or less than 0, we can cause that to respawn us back to the starting point of our island. And in fact, we can even start getting more sophisticated and establish that maybe we have a fixed number of restarts or a fixed number of lives, and the moment that we exhaust those lives, we have to restart the game. So we can use this basic method to create a really simple inventory system, and we'll start to push that forward with the concept of health. And if we lose all of our health, we'll effectively have to respawn. But we'll do that in the next presentation.